Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, I'm Annie and I'm here today with Martin Brazier, who's one of our senior data protection consultants here at URM. So welcome to another episode of Talk DP. So today we're going to be looking at the data protection considerations of facial recognition technology, which is just becoming an increasingly widespread part of our society. So Martin, can you just give us a little bit more detail on why facial recognition is such a hot topic at the moment?
Well, I guess it's been bubbling under and ever present for a few years now, not least because the advances in technology have made it easier and cheaper and more reliable for businesses to deploy, as well as increasing use by public bodies and law enforcement. Also, there's been a recent move by the government to encourage far greater use of facial recognition technology by police forces. And this is having the effect of increasing research on facial recognition, stimulating the marketplace, and adds to the overall body of knowledge on compliance issues. And this has also reopened the discussions on privacy and surveillance concerns about facial recognition, which started around 2018 with some legal action that took place regarding the use of facial recognition by South Wales Police and the Metropolitan Police, as well as at a mixed retail development that was going on at the time. Those concerns voiced by the privacy pressure groups at the time still won't go away, and you'll find those issues on all of their websites. They include the sort of general threat to privacy that facial recognition poses in their view, and the sort of alleged expansion into a sort of surveillance state. Their concerns include the poor accuracy of the technology that's been found in part in the government's own trials, the emergence of ethnic bias in some of the technology, whereby black faces, for example, are far more likely to be misidentified. So any organisation considering deploying facial recognition would be wise to be alert to these concerns and use them to ensure that their deployment is fully compliant and that they can answer those concerns. But it isn't just a matter of compliance. It's been shown that there's a genuine public concern that the use of facial recognition should be necessary and proportionate and shouldn't be used for sort of trivial or convenience issues.
And what types of facial recognition are there available and what are they used for?
Well, I guess there are two broad types of facial recognition. The first is retrospective facial recognition, and this is where an image of an individual is compared to a database of photographs to see if that individual is in that database. A good example would be the police using a custody photograph to compare against other images that they already hold in the police national database. If, for example, they believe the subject is using an alias or perhaps refuses to identify themselves. A variation of this is the police officer initiated facial recognition, where an officer lawfully stops a person, perhaps as part of stop and search or under a traffic stop, takes a photograph of them using a normal mobile phone camera and to try and identify them. This might be used, for example, if the person is incapacitated or perhaps deceased and unable to identify themselves. There may be a language barrier, or if they again refuse to identify themselves. The second main broad type is live facial recognition, and this is where everyone passing in view of a video camera has their biometric profile generated, and that profile is checked against the profiles in a database of known individuals. The outcomes that information is maybe retained for future intelligence purposes, or it causes an alert for action to be taken. So an example here would be cameras outside a football ground may be used to identify known troublemakers or those that are already banned from attending football matches. over the last few years, and particularly since the lockdown, there's been a few products out there in the marketplace which are selling quite well. There's a Scottish-based company that is selling a solution to schools for verifying payments with for school lunches using prepayment cards. There's an online product now where you can upload a photograph of yourself to see if your image is published online. It checks against images, about 900 million of them, that are scraped from the internet, but they don't include social media images from social media sites. To do so, the user must declare that they are using their own image, and they can opt out to their image being included in the sort of scraping of the internet, which maybe implies that they don't get to opt into that in the first place. There is a product available for use in retail, whereby a video camera captures images of all people entering a store, for example. It generates a biometric profile, which is checked against the biometric profile of known shoplifters. An alert is issued to staff that the person has entered the store. This is been widely reported that it's used in quite a few branches of a national supermarket in the southeast. It's been used in a chain of well-known sports shops and in quite a few chains of convenience stores. Facial recognition is also used in the gambling industry, in betting shops and casinos, to prevent or detect crime, to manage responsible gambling, and to detect money laundering and things like that. But I will add, as a bit of a cautionary tale, Clearview AI had a product which gathered images from the internet for face searches, but that did include images from social media sites as well, meaning it had over 30 billion images in its database. However, in 2022, it was fined £7.5 million by the Information Commissioner's Office for breaches of data protection legislation. And I suppose the lesson that we take from that is, if you were using a technology which was found subsequently to be unlawful, how would that affect your organisation's reputation?
That's a great point. So if you are considering using facial recognition technology, what would you say the data protection considerations are?
Well, first of all, organisations, of course, must comply with the UK General Data Protection Regulation, or UK GDPR, and the Data Protection Act 2018, or DPA. Police forces have to comply with Part 3 of the Data Protection Act, which covers processing for law enforcement purposes. There are further complications if the processing involves criminal record data or images of children, for example, but we won't cover that in any detail today. There may be other legal requirements, of course, but let's concentrate on data protection for now. You, first of all, must take a position of privacy by design and default. So that is, you must design the product with its use and its use with data protection in mind, and ensure that at a base level it makes the least inroads into a person's privacy. It's no good looking at data protection after the solution is designed or procured, or even worse, implemented, because it's not always possible to retrofit compliance into a final solution. Article 35 of the UK GDPR makes the completion of a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, mandatory where processing places a high risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects, in particular where it involves automated processing, large-scale processing of special category data, and biometric data used in facial recognition is special category data, or systematic monitoring in a public area on a large scale. So it's fairly likely that with facial recognition, a DPIA will be mandatory, but even not, I would recommend that one is completed, whether it's mandatory or not, because it allows the systematic consideration of privacy risks and compliance issues, and forms a record which you would need to comply with the accountability principle, so you can demonstrate your thought process. You would also need to consider your lawful basis, as defined in Article 6 of UK GDPR. Most of these 6 lawful bases start with the words processing is necessary for. So there we've got our first consideration of necessity. Necessary in this context doesn't mean that it is absolutely essential, but it has to be more than just useful or convenient. There are practical difficulties with using consent as a lawful basis. How, for example, would you obtain and record freely given specific informed consent through a clear and positive affirmative action, which is required by the legislation, from people entering a supermarket, for example, or attending a football match? I'm not quite sure how you would do that reliably. Other lawful bases might apply, including public task if you happen to be a public body. But often the only lawful basis which applies is legitimate interests. For this, you've got to undertake a legitimate interest assessment, which balances your interest with the data subject's rights and freedoms. If your objective can be reasonably achieved without any facial recognition processing, then this might be difficult to justify. As we mentioned a few moments ago, facial recognition involves generating a biometric profile, which is special category data. So you also need to find a lawful basis under Article 9 of the UK GDPR. Many of the lawful bases in Article 9 require further safeguards, which are set out in Schedule 1 of the Data Protection Act. They also need an appropriate policy document, which sets out the lawful basis, any procedures for complying with the principles, retention and deletion policies, and so on. Some of the Schedule 1 safeguards require processing to be strictly necessary, and this really does mean that the task can't be performed without that processing. Processing is also required to be fair, which means that it mustn't be unduly detrimental, unexpected, misleading, and it mustn't have any unjustified adverse effects on the data subject. In other words, it must be reasonable and proportionate. There's also a question of transparency and the provision of information under the right to be informed, which is in Articles 13 and 14 of the UK GDPR. Again, this presents some practical difficulties. To tell people what you're doing. Is a sign on a shop door that facial recognition is being used sufficient? Is it sufficient to have it on the shop's website privacy notice, for example? And how would you inform people maybe in a large open public area?
I've noticed the words necessity and proportionality keep cropping up. So what questions should we ask ourselves when considering compliance on a facial recognition deployment?
Well, I suppose the first question is, are we considering compliance early enough in the process? Again, I've mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating that it's too late once the solution is bought and the contract signed. You need to do that very early. Have we researched public concerns about the use of facial recognition generally and in our type of deployment specifically? And how can we address those concerns and defend our actions? Have we completed a data protection impact assessment, and is everyone in the organisation comfortable with its findings and the controls that we need to put in place? What are the privacy risks, and how could we reduce them? So, for example, could images and biometric profiles collected as part of live facial recognition in a store be deleted automatically after the matching process if no match exists? How do we ensure that data isn't reused for purposes, for other purposes other than the facial recognition, such as this comes under the purpose limitation principle? And the example I've just mentioned, if we do keep images, what if you want to use them to identify and reward regular customers or help with mobility challenges, for example? Would that be an appropriate reuse? If we're relying on legitimate interests as our lawful basis, have we completed a legitimate interest assessment? Is it comprehensive enough to withstand challenges from data subjects and the regulator? Do we need to develop an appropriate policy document? One of the key issues, I think, and one that poses most difficulties is, does the technology actually work reliably, and can we test it in some way? What level of accuracy are we happy to accept? Do we need to continuously monitor whether it's effective as once it's in place? We've heard, of course, recently that technology is never perfect. We've heard about the Post Office Horizon scandal, for example. So what are the consequences if the system gets it wrong? What is if a person is incorrectly challenged in a store because the system has incorrectly flagged them as a shoplifter? What about somebody wrongfully arrested for a crime after I've been identified by facial recognition? What would we do? Do we need to add in a stage of human interpretation or approval before acting upon the results of the system, just to check that to make further checks that the technology has got it right? Does the system display any bias, as I mentioned before, about blackfaces being less likely to be correctly identified? Can we test for that? Do we need to monitor the system to ensure that bias doesn't occur? Can we mitigate it against it, for example? Is the processing consistent with the organisation's values and ethics? Who decides on that? Who signs it off on whether it's compatible with an organisation's values? Would that be the board, for example? I know some organisations have an ethics committee that may do that. Are there any unintended consequences of the proposals? Will complaints increase? Will we get more data protection subject access requests for the facial recognition that we're processing? And finally, as we've discussed about necessity and proportionality, how might the proposals be viewed by the average person, the man in the street? For example, if the police were to use live facial recognition on a high street temporarily to maybe locate a person who presents a danger to the public, or to find a vulnerable missing person, people probably are going to be happy with that scenario. But what if the installation was permanent and maybe used to identify something less important, like those who are littering or parking inconsiderately? What number of convictions would justify the use of facial recognition? Is the use in schools for verifying something as simple as lunch payments necessary and proportionate? How would you feel if you were refused service in a betting shop because you had been correctly identified as a problem gambler when you're just putting on your one annual bet on the Grand National? One of the things that we found is, if you can, it's always best to ask, to contact your customers, speak with your stakeholders and shareholders, check with other facial recognition users on their experiences. Focus groups can be a very good way of testing public or customer attitudes to new technology. So it's always best to prepare rather than fight a fire afterwards.
Thank you very much, Martin. Some really interesting questions you've raised there that I think are going to become increasingly important as time goes on. So for people that want to find out a little bit more about this subject, Martin's written a great blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, called The Data Protection Considerations for Facial Recognition Technology. So please go check that out. And thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.